Welcome back. We're going to be continuing our study in Judges. We're going to be looking at the stories of Othniel and Ehud. If you missed any of the previous videos, there's a link in the description to kind of find those, and also for the digital copy of the notes for this section. So go ahead and grab that before we begin today. We're going to go ahead and get started. So I posed you with some questions the last time we were here, and one of those was, how does Othniel's story set up the downward spiral? Well, one of the things we see is that before, when we ended, we kind of looked at the paradigm for the downward spiral in Judges chapter 2. Well, Othniel's story actually kind of recapitulates the downward spiral and is basically using Othniel as a generic example using a human judge. But what we see here is that the downward spiral becomes more real. It becomes more concrete because it's actual people and places being fit into that downward spiral, and it kind of makes it more real to us. And it's easier for us to relate to human characters than just some generic idea of this happening, then that happening, then as a result of those two things happening, something else happens. It's easier for us to relate when we see it happening through the lives of actual people. And so Othniel starts that out for us, and it helps us to put ourselves in his shoes, if that makes sense. Now, the other question I posed was, how does the brutality, treachery, and cunning play into the Ehud story? Well, right off the bat in the Ehud story, we're going to see that Ehud uses trickery to trick Eglon, resulting in his assassination. And kind of the assassination is where the brutality part comes in. But we see him using those features to sort of carry out his judgeship. And so we see, compared to Othniel, Ehud starts that downward spiral. We see a flaw in him, whereas in Othniel, he really doesn't have a flaw because he's just presented so generically. The last time we looked at the political decline and the religious decline. So we looked at the people-to-people relationships, and we saw that Israel did not drive the people out of the land, which resulted in a confrontation with the angel of the Lord, basically saying, now I'm not going to continue to drive them out of the land, sort of as a result of their disobedience. And with the religious decline, the people-to-God relationship, we saw that Israel rejects Yahweh as their God in favor of the gods of the foreign people. And then this rejection establishes the pattern of the downward spiral, and we see the same consequence that we saw in the political decline. God will no longer drive the people out, and the people and their gods are going to be a snare to Israel. And we see that being fleshed out throughout the rest of Judges. So now come the consequences. When we get into these Judges, we're going to see the consequences of Israel doing what they've done. So let's jump right in. Othniel. Othniel is the prototype judge, and we find his story in verses 7 through 11 of chapter 3. So let's go ahead and look at that real quick. There's 7 through 11. So let me just read this. The Israelites did what was evil in the sight of Yahweh, forgetting Yahweh their God, and worshiping the Baals and the Asherahs. Therefore the anger of Yahweh was kindled against Israel, and he sold them into the hand of King Cushan-Rishathaim of Aram Naharim. Try and say that 3 times fast. And the Israelites served Cushan-Rishathaim 8 years. But when the Israelites cried out to Yahweh, Yahweh raised up a deliverer for the Israelites, who delivered them, Othniel, son of Kenaz, Caleb's younger brother. The Spirit of Yahweh came upon him, and he judged Israel. He went out to war, and Yahweh gave King Cushan-Rishathaim of Aram into his hand, and his hand prevailed over Cushan-Rishathaim. So the land had rest 40 years. Then Othniel, son of Kenaz, died. So one of the things we're going to see right out the gate is this recapitulation of the downward spiral. What we learned about in chapter 2 of the specific elements of the downward spiral, we see here take on concrete reality in Othniel's story. Even though Othniel's story is very generic, nothing really exciting happens. It's just this happened, then that happened, then this happened, then as a result of those things, then the last thing happened. Like, it's not very, it's very generic, even though it is applied to a specific context, which is Othniel's. We see that the Israelites did what was evil in the sight of the Lord, and they worshipped foreign gods. So God's anger was kindled against them, right? So he gave them up to their enemies. And then the Israelites cried out because of their oppression. So God raised up a deliverer who happened to be Othniel, and the Spirit was upon him. And so he went out to war, and he defeated the king, and then the land had rest all the days of Othniel until he died. So that's just that generic recapitulation of the downward spiral, but we see it happening in a specific context with Othniel and this other king, and we see that playing out. Now, Othniel is a prototype judge because he's not flawed. There's no flaw mentioned in Othniel here in the scripture passage. Let's just look at this again. There's no flaw here mentioned in the scripture passage, but what we're going to see in the judges that are coming up, there will be specific flaws listed that makes you call into question their ability to judge effectively. But Othniel here, we're not giving any disqualifications as to his readiness to be a judge. And one of the interesting things about that is that already Othniel has made an appearance in Judges, and he's shown to be a strong man of God. He has the right pedigree because he's from Caleb's family. He's Caleb's younger brother, and Caleb was the spy who was sent into the land who gave a favorable report in the time of Moses. So we see Caleb getting it right, Othniel, his younger brother, getting it right, Othniel going to battle with Caleb to take Caleb's inherited territory and getting his wife Aksha as a prize of war, so to speak. So we see Othniel being the strong man of God paired with a very shrewd woman of God, and they become like this unstoppable force. But we see Othniel here getting it right. He's not flawed. He follows Yahweh's commands, and he is a good example. He's really a great example, and he sets up what we're going to see throughout the rest of Judges is a deviation from this good pattern of God raising up a person to deliver Israel. And we're going to see that when we look at Ehud here in a few minutes. But the Othniel story serves as a prototype. This is what we need to use to compare all the other judges, because all the other judges are going to fall short of this paradigm that Othniel's setting up here. And the important thing is, it's where they fall short that becomes important for us interpreting their stories. Or if there's like an omission, then that becomes really important for interpreting the those specific judges. And so when we get to that, I'll point out those areas. But this is sort of what we're supposed to judge, so to speak, the rest of the judges off of, is Othniel's example. Now, it is very short, it's compact, and it's very generic, but it's like that for a reason, because it's setting you up to show you this is the ideal way a judge is supposed to judge. And we're going to see all the rest of the judges don't measure up to that. There's major flaws or there's major omissions that make you call into question what's even going on. And that's part of what Othniel's story serves as, is a way for us to measure all the other judges against Othniel and to see what's actually happening with that. But before we get into Ehud's story, because Othniel doesn't really have a lot going on for him besides what I was just talking about. Before we get into Ehud's story, I want to take a look. Here at foreign god worship. So we saw already in the text here in the scripture. Where are we? Verse 7. So what did they do? They worship the Baals and the Asherahs. So what I want to look at real quick is who is Baal. So Baal is a Canaanite god. Now you can pronounce that Baal or Baal. It doesn't really matter. Baal is a Canaanite god. And the best way to describe him is that he sort of owned and controlled the land. He was responsible for what happened with the land. So the fruitfulness of the land and the fertility of the land became very important. This is what was believed, that he was in control of these things. So if you wanted good crops, or you wanted your cattle to be very fertile and reproduce, or to have good fruit on your trees, you would make sacrifice and worship to Baal, because he was the god who took care of the land, who controlled the land. Now, one of the things you need to sort of understand is the difference between Baal worship and the worship of Yahweh is that Baal really worked through appeasement and manipulation. This was a god that was trying to get something from you. It's not like Yahweh where it's grace-based, where we just come and we ask. There's no appeasement or manipulation of God. We can't force his hand to do anything, right? But with Baal, it was a little different. it worked, and this is basically a lot of the gods of that time. They worked through appeasement and manipulation. Either you wanted to appease a god so that he wouldn't rain down fire on you, so to speak, or you wanted to manipulate a god to get what you wanted from that god. Basically, you give the god a little something, and then they give you a little something in return. And so we see Baal working in this way because he was the one who owned and controlled the land and was responsible for the fruitfulness and the fertility of the land for their crops and their cattle and stuff. So what the people would do is they would worship in certain ways in order to either appease Baal or sort of manipulate him or provoke him to have a certain response. And so you see this mechanistic idea coming up of how we can control and manipulate God to get our desired outcome. And we see this really being taken on by Israel when they do worship Baal and they're trying to transfer that over to Yahweh. You really see this come alive later in the scriptures when we talk about the different Israelite kings. But you see this idea of how God works, right? God with a little g. You see how this works translating into worship of Yahweh, thinking that we can appease or manipulate Yahweh to get a certain desired effect. I mean, you kind of see this coming out in the scripture when it talked about the Israelites going out to war and they bring the Ark of the Covenant out to war, thinking that's going to somehow win them the battle because they're thinking about manipulating God, that since the Ark's out there, then that means he must bring victory. And we find that doesn't work because they end up losing the battle, and I think it's the Philistines end up taking the Ark, and it just doesn't work out. It doesn't work out for the Philistines either, but it doesn't work out for Israel because God is not manipulated. He doesn't work this way. So Baal was one of the main gods of the land that Israel was going in to occupy. And one of the things we read in Deuteronomy is that Israel is supposed to essentially vanquish the people of the land and their gods and not inquire about how they worship their gods or take their women as wives because it would seduce them away from worshiping Yahweh. And here's one of the reasons why they say that. It's because of how Baal is worshipped. Now, there are some very normal, regular ways of worshiping Baal to a certain extent. You know, they would burn incense. They would have sacrifices like animal sacrifices, which is something you find with how Yahweh is worshipped. There's incense and there are animal sacrifices as well. But what made Baal different and probably very seductive in the eyes of Israel were their fertility rites. One of the ways you would worship Baal is you would go and pay a temple prostitute and have sex with that temple prostitute. And you having sex with a temple prostitute would sort of manipulate Baal into doing the same thing, into making the land fruitful. So, as you can imagine, to some of the people, that would seem very appealing. Wait, you mean when I worship this God, I get to go have sex with a temple prostitute? That's one of the ways I worship? Yep. Oh, okay. Well, this God sounds great to me, right? You can just see how this really plays into people's fleshly desires, because you got to take all of this out of stained glass. Okay, bring this down into real life where we live and work, and just think about this. Who wouldn't want to worship a God where one of the ways you worship a God is by having sex with someone else that is not your spouse? Doesn't that sound appealing? It surely did to the Israelite people, because they took on to this. And then especially, you marry a foreign woman who is already grew up in Baal worship, and she's wanting you to go worship Baal so that the crops this season are going to do well. And she urges you, go out to the temple and rent a temple prostitute so that we can appease Baal. I mean, can you see how all of that plays into our fleshly desire? So we see here in the worship of Baal some real things that grab us, that grab at our flesh and make us want to worship in this way because it satisfies our fleshly desire, as opposed to the way we worship Yahweh, which is not through temple prostitution or through human sacrifice. And we'll get to human sacrifice in just a second. But it's not through temple prostitution, because God says you keep that within the bounds of your marriage. right? Fornication and adultery have high prices, so to speak, of consequences when it comes to being Yahweh's people. And so the worshiping the way of Baal and Asherah, why wouldn't you want to do that? It sort of gives into that fleshly desire. And it's not just sex. I mean, it definitely is that. That's probably one of the main components. But also just the idea of greed, right? So I want more crops and more cattle to have more money, to have more. So I'm going to go worship Baal, who's going to give me more if I just appease him and do a little bit of manipulation through the temple prostitute or human sacrifices or other sacrifices that will help me get more for me. Whereas the worship of Yahweh doesn't work like that. It's not about you getting more. It's about being thankful for God for providing these things, and then you, out of your abundance, share with those who don't have as much. So you see how tempting Baal worship could be, because you got to do temple prostitution, but also human sacrifice. So one of the things for Baal worship doesn't come across so much in Judges, but later on in the prophets, human sacrifice becomes a characteristic of Baal worship, where basically people would pass their children through fire. They would basically offer their children, their infants, their babies, right, as sacrifices, like burnt offering sacrifices to these gods. Now, we sort of do the same thing today. It's called abortion, right? But we don't wait until they're born. Back then, they really didn't have any choice. They had to wait till people were born before they could sacrifice them, so to speak. But we sort of do this today in the sense of abortion, where we come up with some excuse of why we can't have this person or this human, and so we sacrifice them, but we make it seem like a self-sacrificial thing, like, oh, I can't afford to have another child, so I need to give them up, right? Or have an abortion. But the same thing was going on back then, because there really wasn't birth control back then, so they sort of came up with a way and fitted into the worship of this god Baal, where they could sacrifice their children, really reducing their burden, but still having it as a way to appease their god. And so again, we see this working of the fleshly desire in Baal worship through prostitution, also through human sacrifice, because these are things that we sort of want to do. We want to have sex with other people that are not our spouse, because that's just our fleshly desire. And we want to be rid of the responsibility of raising children, because it's really, really tough, especially back then when, having mouths to feed was difficult. There wasn't any food you didn't eat. So it became a great way to sort of rid yourself of this burden without feeling guilty, because you could say, I'm just worshiping my God. So you could see Israel moving into the promised land was really seductive for them, the way they worship their gods, because it plays to our human desires, whereas the worship of Yahweh really does not. It really does not. Now, the last little thing I want to hint on about foreign god worship is Israel moving from being nomadic to agrarian. So nomadic, they were shepherds. They were wandering all around the wilderness. And now as they move in the promised land, they're settling in cities and towns. They're staying put. They're becoming more farmers rather than shepherds. Now, this is not the first time Israel had a switch in how they sort of live life. Back when they were in Egypt for 400 years, when they were slaves, they were more agrarian back then because they were slaves. They were in one place. They were helping build up Egypt and work their farms and be slaves to Pharaoh. So back then, they were agrarian. Then they moved to being nomadic after God brought them out of the land. And when he moves them into the promised land, they become agrarian again. And so you see the idea of worshiping Baal, who owned and controlled the land, was very important for people who were switching in to an agrarian mindset, right? Because they were shepherds for a whole generation. Now they're going into the promised land. These people are already worshiping Baal, who owned and controlled the land. And now they're coming in to be agrarian, and they're like, well, how do we do this? And the people of the land are like, oh, well, this is how you do it. This is how you farm. Oh, and this is the God you worship to bless the land that you are on. So you see the subtle seductiveness of the people of the land and why God told them the Israelite people, you eradicate the people of the land. You push them out. You do not assimilate them. You do not take their daughters for your wives or give your daughters to be their wives. You have nothing to do with them because they're going to lead you astray. And what did we find out last time? The Israelites were led astray because they did not push the people completely out of the land. And so we have this big problem here. And when they were back in Egypt too, they had Egyptian gods that they had to deal with. If we look here at Exodus real quick, we'll take a slight detour. Exodus 12:12. I will pass through the land of Egypt that night, and I will strike down every firstborn land of Egypt, both human and animals, and on all the gods of Egypt I will execute judgments. I am Yahweh. So this is Yahweh talking about the last plague and how he's going to execute judgment on all the gods of Egypt, because there were gods in Egypt. There were gods that were responsible for the sun and for the water and for the fertility of the soil and for the fertility of animals and for all other sorts of things. And God's basically saying these plagues are going to be judgments against the gods of Egypt in order for you Israelites to know that there is only one God, Yahweh himself. That's it. Because you have to remember, these people were down in Egypt for 400 years. They were slaves. Chances are they took on the gods of Egypt and learned how they were worshipped and followed along with some of that stuff. I mean, that's 400 years down there. So Yahweh had to not only execute these judgments on the land of Egypt to free his people, but to free the people from the gods of Egypt in their own minds, to show them that Yahweh is the one who controls the Nile, right? Yahweh is the one who controls the animals or the bugs. Yahweh is the one who controls the sun and the moon and the stars. Yahweh is king over all those things, not these other Egyptian gods. So we see here God saying that he's going to execute judgment on the gods of the Egyptians, and those plagues are sort of set up to show that God is the one who is sovereign, or Yahweh is the one who is sovereign over all that. There's also another spot in Numbers 33. Let's look at here real quick. 33, 3-4. They set out from Ramesses in the first month, on the 15th day of the first month. On the day after the Passover, the Israelites went out boldly in the sight of all the Egyptians. While the Egyptians were burying all their firstborn, whom Yahweh had struck down among them, Yahweh executed judgments even against their gods. So part of the plagues that we see happening in Exodus is to help free the Israelite people from the bondage of the Egyptian gods, to show that Yahweh is king over these gods, or really that these gods are nothing, and Yahweh is the one who is king over all these different areas of Egyptian life that Egypt had put gods over, if that makes sense. Because it's one thing to get the people out of Egypt, and it's another thing to get the thinking of Egypt out of the people. And so that's what God was trying to do. So we see here that Israel has struggled with foreign god worship even before they get into the promised land. And that was when they were agrarian in Egypt. Well, now they're moving back in to be agrarian, and we're seeing they're taking on the gods of that land again. And this doesn't work out very well at all. Now let's take a quick moment, because I want to fast forward to where this all comes to a head about Baal worship. So if we come back to our scripture real quick again, and we look at 1 Kings 18, we're going to see Elijah on Mount Carmel having a showdown with the prophets of Baal. So 1 Kings 18, we can start up here. Let's back up real quick. So Elijah is set up to be a prophet, and he gives his first word. As Yahweh, the God of Israel, lives, before whom I stand, there shall be neither dew nor rain these years except by my word. So already Yahweh is saying through Elijah, I am the God who controls rain, not Baal. I control the land, and there will not be rain these years. Now we know, after reading further along, it's about 3 years or 3.5 years. But he says it up here, there will be no rain these years. Okay. Then we come down here, chapter 18, verse 1. After many days, the word of Yahweh came to Elijah in the 3rd year of the drought. So it's been 3 years, saying, go present yourself to Ahab. I will send rain on the earth. Now, Ahab is a bad Israelite king. But here he says, I'm going to send rain on the earth. Then what we have here is a showdown between Yahweh and his prophet, which is Elijah, and the prophets of Baal. So basically going to see who is truly God, Baal or Yahweh. Who's going to be the one that is going to stand this test? So one of the things we have here is in verse 19. Now therefore have all Israel assemble for me at Mount Carmel with the 450 prophets of Baal and 450 prophets of Asherah who eat at Jezebel's table. So we're having a meeting where we're going to have this test. Either your God is going to burn up the sacrifice on top of the mountain, or my God is going to burn up the sacrifice on top of the mountain. And whoever God does, then we know that that God is truly God. Okay? So Ahab sent to all the Israelites, and they assembled the prophets at Mount Carmel. So, and then here we go. Here's where Elijah throws down the gauntlet. Elijah then came near to all the people and said, how long will you go limping with 2 different opinions, right? Talking about Yahweh or Baal. If Yahweh is God, follow him. But if Baal, then follow him. So there it is. The people did not answer him a word. Why? Because they wanted to see what happened. Then here's the challenge. And Elijah said to the people, I only am left a prophet of Yahweh, but Baal's prophets number 450. Let 2 bulls be given to each of us. Let them choose 1 bull for themselves, cut it in pieces and lay it on the wood and put no fire to it. I will prepare the other bull and lay it on the wood and put no fire to it. Then you call on the name of your God, and I will call on the name of Yahweh. The God who answers by fire is indeed God. All the people answered, well spoken. So there's the challenge. If your God answers in fire, then we know that he is truly God with a big G. If my God Yahweh answers in fire, then we know that my God Yahweh is God with a big G. So the prophets of Baal go first. So the prophets of Baal, took the bowl that was given them, prepared it, and called on the name of Baal from morning until noon. So many, many hours, crying, oh, Baal, answer us. But there was no voice and no answer. They limped about the altar that they had made. At noon, Elijah mocked them, saying, cry aloud, surely he is a god. Either he is meditating, or he has wandered away, or he is on a journey, or perhaps he is asleep and must be awakened. So Elijah's mocking them. Then they cried aloud, and as was their custom, they cut themselves with swords and lances until blood gushed out over them. So remember, appeasement and manipulation. This is what they're trying to do. But that's not how Yahweh works. As midday passed, they raved on until the time of offering of the oblation, but there was no voice, no answer, no response. Then Elijah said to all the people, come closer to me. And all the people came closer to him. First he repaired the altar of Yahweh that had been thrown down. Elijah took 12 stones according to the number of the tribes of the sons of Jacob, to whom the word of Yahweh came, saying, Israel shall be your name. With the stones he built an altar in the name of Yahweh. Then he made a trench around the altar large enough to contain 2 measures of seed. So basically he cuts the wood, puts the offering on the wood, and then he soaks the whole thing down with water to make it even more impossible for fire to come and burn it up. And then here is Elijah's plea to God. At the time of the offering of oblation, the prophet Elijah came near and said, O Yahweh, God of Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, let it be known this day that you are God in Israel, that I am your servant, and that I have done all these things at your bidding. Answer me, O Yahweh, answer me, so that this people may know that you, O Yahweh, are God, and that you have turned their hearts back. You hear any appeasement or manipulation in that? No. Then the fire of Yahweh fell and consumed the burnt offering, the wood, the stones, and the dust, and even licked up the water that was in the trench. So Yahweh answers in fire and consumes the whole thing. What's the people's reaction? When all the people saw it, they fell on their faces. Good job, people. And said, Yahweh indeed is God. Yahweh indeed is God. That's true. Elijah said to them, "Seize the prophets of Baal, do not let them escape." Then they seized them, and Elijah brought them down to the Wadi Kishon and killed them there. So, this is the thing that we see happening in 1 Kings with Elijah and the Mount Carmel incident, is that Baal is challenged and Baal is defeated, and Yahweh is shown to be the God who answers by fire and who controls the rain and all that stuff, and the people recognize it, which is extremely important. But we see how foreign god worship really infects Israel because it's so seductive, the way that they worship Baal through the prostitution and the human sacrifice, and also through appeasement and manipulation, because this means that their God isn't always around and that they can have some control. And one of the things we tend to do is we like to have a sense of security and we like to have a sense of concrete security in things that we can control. Yahweh is not a God we can control. But Baal sort of is, because we can manipulate him and appease him. And the way that we do those things is through stuff that indulges our flesh. So why wouldn't we want to worship Baal? It helps us be sinners, if that makes sense. But Yahweh doesn't work like that. And so Israel has always faced this issue of foreign god worship. And we can sort of see why they do, because it is very, very seductive. So we're going to pick up in the next one and talk about Ehud.